My mom pulled me aside and whispered that I should leave my sister's party because my hoodie was embarrassing them in front of the guests. She had no clue that this cheap hoodie was a prototype for my new collection, and that this entire venue, even the champagne in their glasses, was paid for by me. I simply walked across the street to my office and opened my laptop. I'm curious to see how fast those smiles fade when, in 10 minutes, the waiter tells them their cards have been declined. My mother had just escorted me out of my sister's extravagant baby shower. It wasn't because of a scene I'd made, but because of my appearance. She looked at my oversized charcoal hoodie, and then at the weathered brick warehouse across the alley, her lip curling in a sneer. "Go sit with the laborers over there, Elena. You're ruining the aesthetic for the photographers. This is supposed to be a high-fashion event, not a soup kitchen." I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply turned my back on the silk ribbons and the stifling scent of expensive lilies. My boots crunched on the gravel of the Denver alleyway, each step taking me further from their fragile glass world and closer to my concrete reality. The air smelled of ozone and fading perfume. Beatrice had already tossed my reserved sign into the trash, literally throwing my place in the family away because I didn't fit the frame. I watched the card land among discarded floral trimmings, a small piece of cardstock with my name on it, now nothing more than debris. It should have hurt more. It should have been a moment of tears and negotiation. But as I crossed the threshold of that alley, something snapped inside me. It wasn't a bone, it was a chain. The invisible, heavy chain I had been dragging behind me for 28 years. For nearly 3 decades, I had forged every rusted link with my own desire to be seen, pulling on it every time I achieved something, hoping they would finally notice. "Look, Mom, I made a major sale. Look, Beatrice, I've launched a new line." And every time, they yanked it back with a dismissive pat on the head. "That's nice, dear. Why don't you get a real job?" Standing there, listening to the muffled laughter echoing from the pavilion, I realized the chain wasn't actually attached to anything. I was the one gripping the cold metal, hoping that if I held on tight enough, they would eventually pull me up. But they weren't pulling. They were cutting me loose. So I let go. I reached into the pocket of my hoodie and pulled out a key card. It was matte black, heavy, and cold. I swiped it against the reader on the rusted steel door of the warehouse. The lock clicked open with a satisfying, industrial thud. The transition was instant. The noise of the city and the weight of their judgment vanished, replaced by the steady hum of high-end servers and the rhythmic thrum of automated precision machinery. This wasn't a dump. This was the heart of the Apex Collective. The logistics crew Beatrice had mocked were actually my lead engineers and operations managers, currently finalizing the distribution for our upcoming expansion into the European market. I walked past them, nodding. They didn't see a failure. They saw the woman who signed their checks. They saw the architect of a brand that had just been valued at 8 figures. I bypassed the main floor and took the private elevator to the top level. My office was encased in soundproof glass overlooking the alley. From this height, the glass pavilion below glowed like a lantern in the early evening light. I could see the tiny, curated figures of my mother and sister posing for photos, raising crystal flutes, completely unaware that the person they had just evicted was looking down on them from a throne of steel. I sat at my desk, a massive slab of reclaimed oak cluttered with fabric swatches and legal documents. I didn't cry. Tears are for people who have lost something. I hadn't lost a thing, I had only gained clarity. I woke up my monitors and logged into the regional property management system. I wasn't just the neighbor. I wasn't just the sister who didn't dress the part. I was the owner. 6 months ago, I had quietly purchased the entire block, including the very building they were using for their party. I was their landlord. As I pulled up the lease agreement on my screen, I realized something else. They weren't just rude guests in my district. They were in direct violation of the rental terms. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the absolute silence of the room. It was the silence of power. I thought about the nights I had spent sleeping on the floor of this very building, sewing prototypes until my fingers were raw, while Beatrice was buying social media engagement and Eleanor was racking up debt to maintain the illusion of old money. They called me lucky. They called my success a fluke. They didn't know the half of it. I wasn't lucky, I was relentless. And they were about to find out exactly what happens when you insult the person who holds the deed to your fantasy world. I opened my private finance dashboard to look at the ledger. Not the business accounts, but the family support fund I had maintained for years. I had treated it like a tax, the cost of doing business with my own blood. I clicked on the folder marked discretionary transfers. The numbers scrolled down the screen in a waterfall of red ink. $5,000 for Eleanor's emergency surgery, which happened to coincide with her trip to a luxury spa in Sedona. $12,000 for Beatrice's failed lifestyle blog. $20,000 loan to my brother-in-law for a tech startup that never actually produced a single line of code. It wasn't just money. It was my dignity, itemized. Every dollar represented a moment where I had tried to buy their love, or at least their silence. I had been the silent investor in their entire existence, financing the very people who mocked me for looking poor in my working clothes. I thought about the psychology of it all, how people who are financially fragile overcompensate with loud signals of wealth. The logos, the flashy venues, the aggressive exclusion of anyone who doesn't fit the aesthetic. Eleanor and Beatrice were terrified. They were terrified that if they stopped performing, the world would see they were hollow. My presence, my quiet success, and my refusal to play their game was a mirror reflecting their own fraudulence. Eleanor hadn't attacked me because I was a failure. She attacked me because I was real, and my reality threatened her carefully constructed lie. My success was built on grit, theirs was built on my wire transfers. I was the structural integrity of their lives. And they had just taken a sledgehammer to the load-bearing wall. I picked up my phone. I didn't call them. I called my chief financial officer. Freeze the secondary accounts, I said. My voice was calm, devoid of anger. The supplementary cards for Eleanor and Beatrice, cancel them immediately. And that standing transfer to the investment firm. Kill it. Effective when? She asked. Effective yesterday. I hung up and looked down at the pavilion again. The party was in full swing, the camera flashes appearing like tiny bursts of lightning. They were celebrating a future they couldn't afford in a building they didn't own, using money that had just ceased to exist. I felt a cold, clean satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge, it was a market correction. They had overvalued their importance and drastically undervalued my contribution. Now the bubble was finally bursting. The silence in my office was absolute. It was the silence of power. I thought about the nights I had spent sleeping on the cold floor of this very room, sewing prototypes until my fingers were raw and bleeding, while Beatrice was busy buying social media followers and Eleanor was racking up credit card debt just to keep up appearances. They called me lucky. They called me an accidental success. They didn't know the half of it. I wasn't lucky, I was relentless. And they were about to discover exactly what happens when you insult the person who holds the deed to your fantasy world. I opened my personal finance dashboard. It was time to look at the ledger. Not the business accounts but the private ones, the family support fund. For years, I had treated it like a tax, the unavoidable cost of doing business with my own blood. I clicked on the folder labeled Loans and Assistance. The numbers scrolled down the screen, a waterfall of red ink. $5,000 for Eleanor's emergency dental work, which coincidentally happened the same week she posted photos from a luxury retreat in Sedona. $12,000 for Beatrice's brand launch, an event that consisted of a single lavish party and exactly 0 products. $20,000 loan to Julian, my brother-in-law, for a fintech startup that never seemed to move past the landing page phase. I scrolled and scrolled. It wasn't just money, it was my dignity, itemized. Every dollar represented a moment where I had tried to buy their love, or at least their silence. I had paid off Eleanor's old debts so she wouldn't lose the family home. I had funded Beatrice's lifestyle so she wouldn't feel left behind. I had been the silent investor in their entire existence. And what did I get for it? A seat by the trash can. This wasn't generosity. This was a subscription fee to a club that didn't even want me as a member. I was financing the very people who mocked me for looking like a laborer. I thought about the costume of insecurity, a concept where people who feel socially or financially fragile overcompensate with loud, aggressive signals of wealth. Logos, flashy venues, the deliberate exclusion of anyone who doesn't fit the Vogue aesthetic. Eleanor and Beatrice were terrified. They were terrified that if they stopped performing, the world would see they were hollow. My hoodie, my quiet success, my refusal to play their game, it was a mirror reflecting their own fraudulence. Eleanor hadn't attacked me because I was a failure, but because I was authentic. My success was built on work, on product, on reality. Theirs was built on credit and my wire transfers. I was the structural integrity of their lives, and they had just taken a sledgehammer to the load-bearing wall. I picked up the phone. I didn't call them. I called my lead financial officer. "Freeze the family accounts," I said. My voice was calm, almost bored. "The supplementary cards for Eleanor and Beatrice. Cancel them. And the standing transfers to Julian's firm. Stop them immediately." "Effective when?" he asked. "Effective yesterday." I hung up and looked down at the glass pavilion again. The party was in full swing. I could see the flash of cameras from the professionals they'd hired. They were celebrating a future they couldn't afford in a building they didn't own, paid for with money that had just dried up. I felt a cold, clean satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, it was a correction. The market was finally correcting itself. They had overvalued their importance and drastically undervalued my contribution. Now the bubble was bursting. But I wasn't finished. The financial cut was just the beginning. I turned back to my computer and opened the legal files for the district. The lease for the glass pavilion was ironclad. No subletting. No unapproved events exceeding 50 people without a specific commercial insurance rider. I scanned the document until I found it, clause 4B. Immediate termination of the lease for violation of safety protocols or unauthorized usage. Beatrice had invited 200 people. I checked the digital insurance file. There was no rider. They were operating an illegal event in my building. I picked up the phone again. This time I dialed my attorney. "Draft an eviction notice," I said. "And schedule a full building inspection for tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp." "For which unit, Elena?" "The glass pavilion." The game was over. They wanted me to be the help. Fine. I would help them pack. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in denial. My phone lit up like a slot machine, a digital ticker tape of their collective unraveling. I didn't answer. I simply watched the notifications roll in. First came the confusion. Beatrice texted, "My card just got declined for the after-party drinks. Call the bank, Elena. It must be a mistake." Then came the irritation. Eleanor left an urgent voicemail, her voice tight with performative shame. "Elena, pick up. The caterer is saying the deposit check bounced. You need to fix this right now. It is beyond embarrassing." Finally, the rage arrived. Julian sent an email with a subject line in all caps, "Unacceptable." The body of the message was a frantic rant about family loyalty and respecting the hierarchy, demanding I release the funds immediately or face consequences. I didn't respond. I didn't even open the messages fully. I simply archived them into a folder labeled Evidence. Their escalation was entirely predictable. When you cut off a parasite, it doesn't apologize, it tries to burrow deeper. They weren't panicking because they missed me. They were panicking because the host organism had stopped feeding them. But amidst the noise, one notification stood out. It wasn't a text or a call. It was a system alert from my building's security. Unauthorized access attempt. Main server room. I frowned. The server room was tucked away in the basement of the warehouse, protected by heavy-duty locks and encrypted keypads. Who would even know it was there? I pulled up the camera feed on my second monitor. It was Julian. He was standing at the keypad, typing in codes with shaking fingers, looking sweaty and desperate. He wasn't at the pavilion anymore. He was here, in my building, trying to breach my digital infrastructure. Then it clicked. The pitch. Tomorrow morning, Julian was scheduled to pitch his failing retail tech company to a potential buyer. He had been bragging about it for weeks at family dinners, acting as if he had already won. A mysterious holding company called the Apex Collective was interested in a $25 million buyout. He thought he was going to be rich. He thought he was going to save the family fortune. He didn't know that the Apex Collective was me. I had set up the holding company to anonymously acquire distressed tech assets. Julian's firm was on the list. I had been considering buying it for parts. The code was decent, even if the management was incompetent. But now, I was watching him try to hack into the very company he was begging to buy him out. I watched him fail 3 times before he kicked the door in a fit of silent frustration. He pulled out his phone and made a call. I zoomed in on the feed. He wasn't calling Eleanor. He wasn't calling Beatrice. He was dialing an offshore number. My eyes narrowed. Why would a small-time tech entrepreneur be calling the Cayman Islands at midnight? I opened the due diligence folder for his company. My team had flagged some accounting irregularities weeks ago, but I hadn't looked closely at the time, assuming it was just sloppy bookkeeping. Now, looking at his frantic face on the monitor, I realized it was something else entirely. I opened the raw financial data and began cross-referencing his business expenses with the dates of my private loans to the family. June 12th, I transferred $10,000 to Eleanor for medical bills. June 13th, Julian's company records a $10,000 consulting fee paid to a shell company in the Caymans. August 4th, I pay off Beatrice's $5,000 credit card bill. August 5th, Julian's company pays $5,000 for server maintenance to that same shell company. The pattern was unmistakable. He wasn't just incompetent, he was embezzling. He was taking the money I gave Eleanor and Beatrice, money they swore they needed for survival, and funneling it into his own offshore account. He was stealing from them, and by extension, he was stealing from me twice. He wasn't trying to save the family, he was trying to cash out and run. I sat back, the cold light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a crime scene. And tomorrow morning, he wasn't going to walk into a negotiation. He was going to walk into an ambush. I called my security chief. Let him go, I said. Don't stop him. Just log the attempt and make sure the boardroom is prepped for tomorrow at 9. I'll be leading the meeting myself. Understood, Elena. Should we have legal present? Yes. And have the police on standby. I hung up and looked out the window. The lights in the glass pavilion across the alley were finally going out. Their party was over, but mine was just beginning. The next morning, the industrial district was cold and bright. I wore the same charcoal hoodie that Eleanor had mocked the day before. To my family, it looked like a sign of poverty. To the industry, it was a limited-run prototype from the Apex Collective, a piece worth more than my sister's entire wardrobe. The point was simple: power doesn't reside in the weave of a garment, it lives in the person wearing it. I sat at the head of a massive concrete table in boardroom A. The room was a study in contrasts, exposed brick walls, stark industrial lighting, my lead counsel to my right, and my CFO to my left. At 5 minutes to 9, the elevator chimed. On the security feed, I watched Julian step out. He was dressed in a tailored three-piece suit, radiating a desperate kind of confidence. He snapped at my receptionist, who was standing in as a floor manager, demanding to see the partners immediately. He straightened his tie in the mirrored doors of the elevator, rehearsing his pitch one last time. The doors slid open. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his hand already extended as he marched into the room. Then he froze. His practiced smile collapsed the moment his eyes met mine. "Elena?" he stammered. You can't be here. This is a high-level acquisition meeting. Security." No one moved. The room remained deathly silent. "Sit down, Julian," I said. He sputtered, rambling about how Eleanor had told him I was struggling, and how I must have followed him to beg for a job. I answered him with a level stare. "I am the CEO of the Apex Collective." The realization hit him in slow motion. He looked at the logo etched into the glass wall, then at the small, identical mark on my sleeve. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I have a valuation of over $30 million, I said. "And you have nothing." I tapped the console on the table. A spreadsheet appeared on the wall-mounted monitors. It was the embezzlement ledger, a map of shell companies, offshore accounts, and years of systematic theft. He collapsed into the chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He began to beg, claiming he would pay every cent back. "With whose money?" I asked. The screen changed. Now it showed the grainy security footage from the night before, Julian, sweating and frantic, trying to force the lock on my server room. Corporate espionage, fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement I listed. Not to mention the lease violations at the pavilion. I leaned forward, my voice dropping an octave. "You're being evicted. The locks on your offices and the pavilion have already been changed." He started to plead about family loyalty, about how Eleanor and Beatrice depended on his success. "They depended on money you stole from them," I replied. I slid a blue folder across the concrete surface. A flicker of hope crossed his face. Perhaps I was buying the company after all. "Open it," I commanded. Inside was a single page. In the center, a heavy stamp in crimson ink read, "Denied." "Leave my building," I said. "The police are waiting for you in the lobby." He walked out without another word, his shoulders slumped, the expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. Later, from my window, I watched them load him into a cruiser. A tailored jacket doesn't do much to hide handcuffs. The fallout was instantaneous. Julian's firm collapsed by noon. Investors fled, federal charges were filed, and his remaining assets were seized. Without my silent funding, Eleanor and Beatrice's world imploded. Their credit cards were declined before the sun set. Their leased cars were repossessed within the week. Desperation set in, followed by a barrage of calls and messages I had no intention of answering. I blocked them all. A week later, I stood on the roof of the warehouse. Across the alley, the glass pavilion sat in total darkness. A crooked "For Lease" sign was taped to the glass entrance. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, clean and sharp. It didn't smell of expensive perfume, or the desperate need for approval. I wasn't the daughter who didn't fit the aesthetic. I wasn't the sister who needed permission to exist. I was the one who owned the ground they stood on. I went back downstairs to find my team waiting. Our new collection was set to launch at midnight. This time, the story wasn't about seeking acceptance. It was about owning the narrative. Self-respect is the most expensive thing you can ever own, and for the first time in my life, I was finally wealthy enough to afford it.